Hello and welcome to Rights of a Free People, a program of the Rhode Island affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. My name is Dan Weissman. I'm a volunteer at the ACLU, and I'll host today's program. Our topic today is part 2 of the recently completed 2010-2011 Rhode Island legislative session. We have with us 3 people who were in the front row, so to speak, of that session. And we're going to go through some bills that were both encouraging and some discouraging in their results. So let me introduce our panel, and then we'll get into it. Starting nearest to me is Representative Chris Blajewski. Almost got it.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you for having me.
Chris represents the 2nd District, which is Providence and East Providence.
That's right.
So thanks for being here, and I hope you enjoyed your first year.
Yes, thank you very much.
We'll hear a little bit about it. Next, I have Teresa Tanzi from the 34th District, which is Narragansett and South Kingstown.
That's correct, yeah.
Oh, well, good to have you, and also this was a freshman term for you.
Indeed,
so
yeah.
We're going to get some freshman stories today. And then an old hand on this, so to speak, on our show and in the legislature is Art Handy, 18th District, Cranston. And thanks again for being here.
Oh, I'm always happy to come in.
Yeah, we have a rule that after a certain number of appearances, you get to be MC, and I get to work a camera.
I have to make sure I'm careful not to come on to me more times.
We keep records. So now let's get into it. As always, we flipped a coin, and Art won. We have a special 3-sided coin for this program. Art won or lost, depending on one's point of view. So Art gets to go first. And the topic, I think one that was a headliner throughout the session, or at various times during the session, was civil unions / same-sex marriage. So many of us in the civil liberties business were pretty disappointed at the results. And so tell us what happened, Art, and where do we stand, kind of where do we, looking forward, where do we go with this?
Sure, I mean, and just to sort of track, I mean, this is my 9th time putting the bill in, in past years, I think I had a much less optimistic perspective on the likelihood of passage this year. I really think everybody, myself included, were positive we were going to pass this, get the thing done early, get it out of the House, and move it over to the Senate. And actually, we had optimism, I think, that the Senate would have moved as well. But
we had a governor saying he would sign it.
That's right. The governor was lobbying for it. He had talked about it in the State of the State speech along the way, that this was an important thing, that it was going to bring in money to the state too along the way. Although that's obviously not the driving force for it.
We're talking about is
the same gender marriage legislation, right? Yeah. And I saw somebody put a pet peeve they had on Facebook or something saying that New York didn't legalize gay marriage, but rather they recognize gay marriage, and I think that's an important point too, an important distinction there too. But my legislation would have done essentially that same thing, had Rhode Island recognized those relationships, not touched the religious side of that equation, let places of faith be able to do what they wanted to do. What wound up happening was I think the speaker's impression was that the legislation wasn't going to pass, and he felt that this compromise was the right solution. I didn't agree with him, but that's neither here nor there at this point in the year, I guess, along the way. So instead, what was introduced was a civil unions bill. The real, I think, rub right now, too, the biggest challenge of it in some ways was that on top of that, then we had a floor amendment that was added that most of us didn't really have a lot of time to look at. Only a few of us voted against it because we just didn't have the full sense of it. I think Rep. Blajewski and myself, I don't know whether you had a chance even to see it long enough to, but essentially that added in some religious protections that in reality I think set up a real opportunity for instead discrimination under the guise of religion. And so that's a real problem under the language. We haven't yet seen that tested. We'll see how that goes. And then the final piece we were talking about a little bit as we were setting up, one of the other real sort of things that are still hanging out there are the couples that were married in other states, gay couples that were married in other states that live here now that want to get divorced. They want to break a legal contract that's recognized by Rhode Island, but yet Rhode Island law doesn't, at least the courts have said that that's not allowed here. I talked to a lesbian the other day. She said she feels like a third-class citizen because she feels that people consider her a second-class citizen because she's gay, and on top of that, she's married and can't get divorced. Her partner left her wife left her after, I think, 6 months of marriage, something like that, and so she's stuck. She's in legal limbo. Her only option is to literally to move out of the state to some other state, Massachusetts or another state like New York, to be able to get legal residency there to get divorced. It's outrageous to me that we weren't able to resolve that piece either when we did the civil unions legislation.
And you know, there are stories already of people renting apartments in Connecticut who want to get a divorce just for the purpose of establishing residency long enough to get the divorce that they're looking for and should be entitled to when they have a legally binding contract in another state. The laws of Rhode Island, through the principles of comity, should be able to provide them with a way to dissolve that contract, as we do for any other contract formed in another state. You know, and another point I think that Art raised was the religious protection language that I'd like to talk about briefly. You know, I don't think anyone thinks that we shouldn't have religious protections, and that's why we have the First Amendment, which provides religious protections. But we've set a balance in this state based on the religious protections that exist and anti-discriminatory laws that were in place at the time. And I think the challenge of the amendment that was put in at the end is that it muddies the waters and makes it unclear to what extent hospitals and other organizations that may or may not be religiously affiliated can not recognize the validity of a legally binding civil union in Rhode Island. And for those of us as an attorney, that concerns me because I think the lack of clarity is inevitably going to lead to some sort of litigation over this issue. And I think as legislators, we like to bring clarity to the law and not the opposite. I think that's something that may have happened with that amendment.
So clarify, if you can, the religious exemptions that were included at the last minute in the civil unions bill that passed. What did that change, those late amendments, that made things even worse? What were the specific changes that those changes brought about?
Sure. So the language, what's really broad about the language is that it says that an organization connected with, in any way, shape, or form, a religion or a religious organization need not recognize the validity of a civil union. So, for example, let's say you're in a civil union and your partner is on death's door, and you arrive at the hospital, and you try to go in there and make those last-minute decisions. There's not a time to go to court and get an injunction and joining someone from preventing you from going in there and making those decisions. These are last-second decisions that need to be made on behalf of a loved one, your partner, which you have legal rights to do. And that hospital can say, look, we do not recognize the validity of your union and therefore need not even offer you admittance into the hospital room, let alone to make decisions. And that, I think, for speaking for myself, but I think my colleagues here, is really a step in the wrong direction and is a regressive change to our currently existing laws.
This amendment is referred to as the Corvese Amendment, and it was put in at the very last minute. You know, just to kind of put into, there's a 36-page guide that GLAAD has put out that kind of goes into what this law means. We shouldn't, this has created more questions, I think, than answers. And I think that anybody who was looking to have, you know, a civil union be everything but the word marriage and providing rights and protections, I think that this really does just leave a lot more questions than answers. And to, you know, just echo what Chris was saying, we're talking about people at their most vulnerable points in these critical life and death moments and junctures, and it is, you know, to quote Governor Chafee himself, I mean, he had on July 15th appeared on a national show called Tell Me More, and he said, quote, "I'm embarrassed to say that Rhode Island does not have full marriage equality. We're the state founded by Roger Williams and the greatest liberties ever granted to any colony in the world in 1663, and now we're trailing our neighboring states." And you look back at what Rhode Island history has done as far as civil liberties, they've always been a leader on tolerance and protections and banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Going back to 1995, We were the 9th in the country to do so for areas of employment. And then you look at 2001, we were the 2nd state in the nation to amend civil rights laws to include gender identity and expression. So we've always been a state that was kind of a leader on these issues, and it's a real disappointment.
And a point that's struck home even more so by the fact that New York has doubled the number of American citizens that have access to marriage equality. And I think it's a lost opportunity for our state to now be sort of in the middle of the pack on an issue where we could have been a leader.
Yeah, it was a big, as someone from New York, it was a very big disappointment to see this state with its civil liberties history really fall down. Really drop the ball on that one. Before moving on, do we have a sense of where we go next with this? What do you see happening the next session? Does marriage come back? Was it a one-time opportunity?
No, I think though that in reality the Senate, the makeup of the Senate and the way things went this session probably has made things rigid for next session. I'm going to introduce the bill again next year, but I think that the opportunity for passage next year would be very difficult. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but something would need to shake things up for that to happen. Probably we need to wait till after the next election cycle, see how the changes happen there, and that's the best opportunity. Probably would be in 2013. But that said, I think next year we ought to be pursuing some of the other bits and pieces. Maybe we ought to try to strip out the religious exemption language, deal with the divorce issue, things like that. Also, are other areas we could also look to. I don't want to call it nibbling around the edges because they're substantial, but still work around the edges.
Okay.
The experience with those other states, just to see what the model's out there. New Hampshire had a civil union law, and then next year had a marriage law. But generally speaking, when a state passes a civil union law, it takes action through the courts until you get full marriage equality. If you look at the way that it's proceeded in other states.
All I can think of is if we get reports out of New York that it was great for the economy. So we get to see the marriage industry lobby for full marriage, but otherwise.
Well, we had Massachusetts. I'm sure the marriage industry saw that and didn't react, unfortunately, that much. Or at least they're not strong enough to have that kind of sway. I suppose the Catholic Church and some of the other folks that were particularly good at lobbying against it were good at lobbying against it.
We have a few other bills to cover, and
sure.
I mean, this was the headliner, but there are a couple of others that are of importance also. Health insurance exchange. Teresa, what happened with that? What is it, and what happened with that?
All right. Well, we had the Healthcare Reform Act passed, and it mandated that individual states create these healthcare exchanges by 2014. And the idea of these exchanges is to provide a one-stop shop for individuals, for businesses to compare different insurance products so that they can provide them for themselves or for their employees. The idea is to have that be this comparison, apples to apples, as well as transparent, fully transparent. So we can have educated consumers making educated decisions, and this all the while fostering the sense of competition between providers, insurance providers. And Rhode Island was leading the way on this process. We have to date had more than $6.2 million in federal grants awarded to us. And we really were among the first to start receiving those awards. 10 other states are now ahead of us with their healthcare exchanges already established. We have lost our momentum as a result of not passing this bill. On September 30th, we approach another deadline for grant applications. And our hope for the state, I think, was to have this piece of legislation passed this year so that we would begin to be able to receive these further tens of millions of dollars in grants that we should have been eligible for. Another little part of the history in the background is that there was a working group of very broad interests that had gotten together for over a year to come to this compromise piece of legislation that was introduced right in the beginning of the session by the Senate President Teresa Tanzi. We're talking about the Right to Life organizations, the ACLU, really just the broadest spectrum of interested parties came together to have this one piece of compromise legislation, and this was supposed to provide the framework for these health exchange bills, really just the most basic of frameworks in order to be able to receive the federal grants. And in the 11th hour, literally moments before this was being heard in the Senate Health and, is it Health, Education, and Welfare?
I think it's Health and Human Services on the Senate
Health
side.
and Human Services on the Senate side. This new language was added at the very last minute. There's still a little bit of gray area as to how this came to happen. But the fact is that the Senate President had inserted this language that is incredibly restrictive, far more restrictive than the federal level. At first, we were assured that all this did was mirror the federal regulations, and that this was, I've heard this twice this session, putting a belt and suspenders on. This was really just an appeasement, a double, security blanket. And that was not the case. This really turned out to be the most restrictive language had it appeared and passed as legislation. It would have prevented health exchange from providing any insurance that was any provider from providing abortion coverage, and they would have to be purchasing a separate rider for that. And reports for states that have language similar to this are that effectively has killed the market for abortions as abortion insurance in those states. So this would effectively have been a ban on insurance for abortions in the state.
But it also made Rhode Island ineligible for federal funds?
Only because we failed to pass the language that the Senate President had put forth. So that was the one point that neither the governor nor the Speaker of the House was willing to compromise on. Everyone stood their ground, and at the end of the day, no compromise was achieved, and so the bill just died. That leaves us now, again, with the September 30th deadline looming. And what this working group has gotten back together, it's headed by Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Roberts, and the group made a recommendation that there be an executive order issued. This executive order, a similar one was done in Indiana, and I believe in Colorado. What this executive order can do is it can create an exchange under an existing agency. What it cannot do is create a quasi-public private institute that